Okay, so let's move to the Yerusha of Daughters. So some of this will be review, some of it will be new, but that's fine. So the Gemara on KosherTube we already saw. So let's just quickly review its arguments. The Benot Lavchad, what is the logical Lumdish argument that the Gemara ascribes to Benot Lavchad for why they should inherit?
So ultimately, okay, so the slop dog himself should inherit.
What is the argument that the Gemara gives, not the Psukim? The Psukim say he wasn't a sinner or he sinned of his own sin. But the Gemara on KosherTube has a very specific argument. Yes.
If they count as sons, then they should inherit as sons. But if they don't count in the category of sons, then their mother should.
Very good, right? That there seems to be Yerusha and Yibum are two sides of the same coin. So you have two options. Their father had no sons, but he did have daughters. Either you think that they count to carry on his legacy, in which case there's no Yibum, but they should inherit when there's no son, or they don't count at all, in which case they don't inherit, but their mother should be able to do Yibum. It's an either-or proposition, right? That's the argument that the Gemara puts in their mouths. And as we talked about, this is because Yerusha is about more than just the transfer of property. It's about the transfer of legacy, and therefore in that sense, Yibum and Yerusha are indeed connected. Okay, but when you think about it, not just logically, but textually, there is a fundamental problem in reading these parsha, which leads to complexity, and that is, how do you understand the words uvein ein lo? And he didn't have a son. So, uven ein lo. What might uven ein lo mean? What possibilities? What might the words uven ein lo mean?
Doesn't have any daughters.
Doesn't have any children, or doesn't have any sons. Not doesn't have daughters. Yeah. Now, what's the problem? It seems to be an explicit contradiction in Psukim. Because in Parshat Pinchas, in the context of Yerusha, what do the words uven ein lo mean? Sons. How do you know it means sons? Well, it's more than that, right? El b'nei Yisrael t'daber lemor ish ki amut uven ein lo meaning it's not just in contrast to daughters. It's meaning, let's be even more precise, Gabi. It does contrast it, but in a very specific way, which is, if and only if there are no sons, do daughters inherit. So uven ein lo means literally male progeny, because if there are no males, then you give it to the females. So uven here means very specifically sons. In the context of Yibum, however, the phrase comes up again. And what does it mean in that context? According to the Gemara here, let's read it. If brothers live together and one of them dies, what?
Why say it together?
That's a good question. You know who asked that question? The Gemara. And the Gemara has two answers, right? One is that prat le'achiv shelo haya be'olamo. Yibum is not performed if the brother is born after the death of the first brother, right? So let's say the parents have a very in time, right? They have a very wide age range, right? So mothers are having their last children at their kids' wedding, things like that.
Is that really necessary to say though?
Then is that Chazal take it? Yachdav means that Yibum is only performed by brothers who lived at the same time. But if a person would die and then a brother would be born, that brother cannot perform Yibum.
But if they didn't say that, and those words weren't there, then what would happen? Like the brother dies, she gets remarried, and then the dead brother has a new sibling, and then
Do you know who asked that question? The Gemara also. Yeah, and the Gemara also has a conversation with that. Yeah, part of the problem is that you can't have someone become chayav and yibum retroactively because that violates fundamental principles of derachei noam. right? That the Torah has to be pleasant, and it can't be that you get remarried and then that marriage becomes illegitimate retroactively. That's impossible. The other drasha that Chazal have is Yachdav. So the Gemara says Miyuchadim b'nachala, right? Those who are designated to inherit, which tells you that you only do Yibum with Achiv min ha'av, right? Paternal brothers. Now that's a bit of a weird drasha. Meshech Chachma argues that it's not a pun. And some people think it's a pun, right? That Yachdav sounds something like Miyuchad, and therefore Yachdav really means uniquely suited to inherit, and therefore it only means paternal brothers. The Meshech Chachma says, no, the drasha is like this. Yachdav can either mean together in time or together in space. Right? And the Chiddush of the Torah is both. That it's brothers who coexist in time, as we just talked about, and brothers who live in the same space. Why is that paternal brothers? Because they inherit the same land and split it. So they always are next door neighbors. Right? You forget this. But in a world like that, you are almost always next door neighbors with your brothers because you're literally dividing up the same property. Yaakov's like, I'm obligated to be next door neighbor to all my brothers. I only have a sister, so yeah, I'm fine. So the pasuk says, "Uven ein lo," and he doesn't have a son. Lo tiyeh isha me'av chutza li'yizar. Now, how does halacha understand uven ein lo in this context? He has no son or no child.
No child.
Child. That's exactly the point. That's the Gemara's proof, right? That if we don't count as sons, so then let our mother inherit. But they do count. So the problem is that there is a straight-up contradiction, because in the context of Yerusha, uven ein lo very specifically means if he has no male children. And by Yibum, we understand it to mean the exact opposite. In fact, that's one of the proofs that daughters do inherit.
Sorry.
Right? Literally, that same pasuk is the proof that daughters inherit. Right? Because the Benot Tzlafat said, either we count as children or we don't. But it's not, when you actually read the words in the pasuk, it's much worse. Because the words from which they derive their rule, uven ein lo, in the context of Yibum means if you have no children, daughters are included. And in the context of Yerusha, they are not included, and that's why uven ein lo, if there's no male children, you give it to the daughter. Right, so the words uven ein lo literally mean opposite things.
Isn't that like before the pasuk existed?
No, uven ein lo still means uven ein lo, you give it to the daughters. Right, the words still mean uven ein lo.
Isn't that like pasuk only come into being after this event?
Yes, but both. Meaning, but in the case of Yerusha, it definitely means sons. So the whole point is uven ein lo, you give it to the daughters.
Right, but I'm saying that one only comes into being after the event. Right?
Correct. The Torah is playing, the Midrash is playing with time, right?
Why don't they just quote the pasuk then while they're at it? Why don't they just?
Well, that's right. That's what the Gemara doesn't do, right? Is that the same tension that the Gemara brings to the fore of comparing Yerusha and Yibum, you realize is not just conceptually required, but it is linguistically required, because that key phrase, uven ein lo, is present in both. So another way of putting the Gemara is exact, right? The Gemara's conversation with Benot Tzlafat is to know that in one place it implies that sons are the only real heirs, or whatever, and in the other place it implies the opposite from the exact same words.
How do you know that you doesn't happen in this daughter?
Well, Chazal assumed that, yes. But the problem is that Chazal's reading of the pasuk leads to a contradiction.
Right.
Yes. And that is...
It appears to be kind of a little bit contrived. I mean, if you want to think about it...
Meaning, of course, the easiest way of dealing with this would have been, no, Benot Tzlafat were right, and the other thing was the right conclusion, right? Meaning, the simplest reading of the pasuk is the opposite. Uven ein lo doesn't inherit, and therefore uven ein lo means if he doesn't have male children, there is Yibum, even if there are daughters. Right? Meaning, the easiest way of dealing with this would have been exactly that, would be to conclude that daughters mean zero when it comes to transferring legacy, and therefore they neither inherit nor are they relevant for the purpose of Yibum. Right? But Chazal don't go in that direction. Right? And that's exactly what I want to figure out. Why do I want to figure this out? Because, one second, let me just finish my thought. Right? The reason I want to do this is because the question we're trying to figure out is what is the nature of Yerusha Habat? Right? Is Yerusha Habat, once the Torah has introduced it, is it unique in the way that Yerusha Habat is? It's just the Torah didn't machadesh it? Or a daughter is more like other Yerushim? Right? The problem is that in Pinchas, it very much sounds like sons are unique compared to anybody else, and daughters are just like every other Yoresh, right? Because there's Uven Ein Lo. There aren't sons are the most important, the most direct, the most, right, as we talked about the last 2 days. Uven Ein Lo. And if he doesn't have male children, so then you go to other Yorshim, which include daughters, fathers, brothers, uncles, right? But daughters are of that side of the equation, right? They're sons on the one side, and everybody else, including daughters, on the other. But the Parsha of Yibum implies that that's not the case, because the sons and daughters equally represent a continuation of legacy such that Yibum is irrelevant. Right? And that's the tension, right? Is that the Psukim seem to mean things in different places, but that also leads to a fundamentally different understanding in terms of Yerusha. Right? We're in the context of Yerusha, Uven and Lo. If there isn't a son, we move to all options B. Right? Right? Son is A, everyone else is B. Right? B prime, right? B subprime 1, subprime 2, but they're basically sons versus everybody else. Right? But Yibum, where Uven and Lo is taken by Chazal to mean sons and daughters, following in the argument of the midrashic argument for Benot Tzlachad, which is either we don't count and therefore a mother can do Yibum, or we do count and we inherit and we rule, you do count for Yibum and you do count for inheritance, right? Militate towards saying that no, daughters are like sons. Right? This is the problem I want to deal with. Right? Meaning the tension is conceptual, the tension is textual. Right? But basically the problem is that we have indications that sons are the prime and daughters are like everybody else. And then we have indications that no, from Yibum, if Uven and Lo does not exclude daughters, that means daughters are really children with the heightened role that they play in the carrying on of legacy. So which is it? Right? Are daughters second rate, right, compared to sons, and they're just like uncles and brothers, right? Or they are essentially prime carriers of legacy, as evidenced by Yibum, right? And once the Torah introduces their Yerusha, you learn they are like sons, right? Yes, Ron.
What is the nafkamina? What is the nafkamina?
So what the nafkamina would be the same types of distinctions that we saw by sons, right? Where certain types of Yerusha only apply to sons.
Oh, okay.
Well, those apply to daughters. Now, in the case of Eved Ivri, how did the Gemara seem to conclude? Almost correct, that sons are unique and daughters are not unique, right? So the question is, what should we expect? Now that seems to push in the direction that sons are unique, everyone else is a different type of Yoresh, including daughters. The question is that always the case? Right? Because again, the sugya of Yibum would have indicated that that shouldn't be the case. Right? The daughters should be like sons, even for the unique ones. Right? Now again, on balance, so far the evidence we've seen, would make you guess which one would be the case. That should daughters have unique inheritance laws like sons, or be like everybody else? On balance. Yeah, right. I think on balance, the evidence that we've seen pushes in the direction they should be like any other heirs. The problem is this Yibum case, right? The problem is that we do have to somehow explain the Yibum dimension where they don't seem to be secondary; they seem to be primary, right? Okay, so let's look at Rav Hirsch, because Rav Hirsch seems to be sensitive to this issue, as does the Torah Tamima, right? I gave you these two commentaries who both seem to be sensitive to this problem, right? Where again, on the one hand, most of the evidence points in the direction of sons being primary and everyone else, including daughters, not being primary, and yet Yibum, which the Gemara itself takes as the paradigm of whether or not someone carries on your legacy, daughters are included. So how do we get there? Right? That's the question that Rav Hirsch and the Targum are both dealing with. I should just point out that this is not surprising. Often, I've mentioned this before, but I'm just going to assume that you've forgotten, as much as I hate assuming that you ever forgot anything, because I know that's us. Right? Yes, it is, as we talked about last year. I hope you remember at least us talking about that. Good, because if you forgot the sugya of it's also forget Torah, that would be too ironic and meta, and I can't deal with it. Okay? Well, then you would. And just who says you get out of it because you're shogeg? I don't know. Okay, anyway. But the Rishonim often don't deal with the question of how do we deal with drashot. Right? You don't find too much in the Rishonim of explaining exactly what Chazal are doing in drashot. But in the last 200 years, there is a resurgence of commentaries who do care about this, partially in response to reform, right? That since the reform movement was challenging the authority of Chazal, Mefarshim that were in conversation with reform or in opposition to reform felt like they needed to defend Chazal, and therefore they returned to the Psukim in that sense. Part of it is that even amongst the reform, there wasn't a return to what has been coined omni-significant readings. Omni-significance is a term that, from what I gather, was simultaneously coined both by James Kugel and and Yaakov Elman. It's a term that is used to describe Chazal's theory of Parshanut, which is that every resonance that might exist in the Torah does exist and should be taken seriously. Resonance. Meaning, that's a term taken from music. Who's a musician here? Okay, so no one knows anything about music? What? Okay, fine, from physics, right? That when you play an instrument, right, there's a primary note, but there are also secondary notes, right? There are secondary resonances, right, that emerge from the instrument, right? And that's why chords play up on that, right? Because when you play a chord, right, 3 notes at once, it's not just that the main notes play off of each other, but the secondary notes do, meaning there's a truth to them. Even though they're not primary, they exist also. And if you properly channel the power of those resonances, you can create a better sound, right? So that idea is what they're talking about in Torah, that there's a primary meaning, but if there are secondary meanings that can be teased out, because it's God, they all actually are there, right? It's not that the Torah only has one meaning. Every possible meaning was intended by God, and therefore should be teased out. Right? That's basically Chazal's, right? That's the way they term Chazal's read. Because in addition to the pshat, there's, if this word appears in 2 places, then we have Ziring-Yerusha, and we derive a new level of meaning, right? Which is independent of the 2 stories, right? It's just that you pick up on the minor hidden meaning of the Ziring-Yerusha, right? Then you get another layer, right? So starting about 200 years ago, Parshanim started to go back and try to read the Torah as Chazal did. So these Mefarshim include people like the Malbim, which is written mostly, in many places at least, as a commentary not directly on the Torah, but on Midrash Halacha, the Torah Kohanim. Then it sits. Later on, the Meshech Chochmah, the Targum a little bit, Rav Hirsch, right? All in different ways are part of this tradition. So Rav Hirsch, 19th century Germany, I assume you knew that. You did know that, right? This is not crazy, right? Yes, Rav Hirsch is one of the great fighters against reform, right? He was very into this. And he won in 1870. Sure, he won. I don't know what that means. He won. He was the gladiator of Orthodox Judaism. I don't know what you want from me. Fine. But Rav Hirsch picks up on this and he says, Uven ein lo. So the Gemara says, how do you know Uven ein lo means sons, daughters, grandchildren? Right? Meaning the Gemara says that by Yibum, even if someone only has a grandchild, meaning he had children, they died and left grandchildren, they're still, right, it's not that Yibum comes back, right, he's still Patur. So the Gemara's proof is that it plays on the word Ein Lo, and to read it not with an Aleph but with an Ayin, right, because sometimes we do these puns on Alephs and Ayins. And what would Ayin Lo mean? What would Ayin mean? Look into it. Meaning that Chazal basically say that when it comes to Yibum, we have a more expansive meaning of progeny. Ayin alav. Look to see if he has any children. If he has any child, so then Yibum doesn't happen. Af ein lo tzetzaim shel ben. And even if he doesn't have children from his son, doesn't matter. Right? Any child, son, daughter, grandchild from sons, from daughters, doesn't matter. Musag haben nitpas kan b'mashma'uto ha'rechava biyoter. Now, if you don't like this Hebrew, I'm sorry. His Perush on Torah was written in German, and therefore I have never read the original. Right? So I only have what they have in Bar Ilan. So if you don't like their Hebrew translation, then learn German and translate it for yourself. Okay? I'm sorry.
Why not English?
What? You can read it. There is an English translation, but it's not in Bar Ilan. I'm happy for you to, when things are not written in Hebrew, I'm happy for you to read it in translation if you're not reading the original. If you can get into Bar Ilan to put the English of Rav Hirsch for free on Bar Ilan, then I will give you the English next time, and I won't give you the Hebrew. But until that happens, I'm not buying the set of Rav Hirsch in English because, you know, I'm capable of reading the Hebrew, and therefore I will go for free. Okay? I'm sorry. Chatati. What? Good. That's your task, Rami. Go learn German and tell me if this is a proper translation. So he says, Musaga ben nitpaskan mashma'uto harechava biyoter. In the context of Yibum, son is taken to mean son in the widest possible construal. V'kolel kol adam shu yotzei yirecho, i.e., any progeny, any descendant, ben zachar, ben nekeva, minit rabah, gam mamzer, son, daughter, legitimate child, illegitimate child. Ukvar amarnu. As this proves, as he's talked about in other cases, that when it comes to civil law, there is no what mufla, haflaya in modern Hebrew is discrimination, right? Meaning, in civil law, we never discriminate even against mamzerim. He says, hashvei. But now you have to compare Uven ein lo b'mishpat Yerusha, the phrase as it appears in the context of inheritance. Where, what does it mean? Not mashma'uto harechava, not the wide construal, but the narrow, which is son, male child, first generation, male child. Ela shekan musaga ben mugdar, so he says, what was the key? How did Chazal know that in the context of Yerusha, son is unique and daughter is not, and in the context of Yibum, son and daughter and grandchild all go under Uven ein lo? What's, in short, Rav Hirsch's answer to why the exact same words are understood in two different ways in the two parashot? In a nutshell, right? One word. Context. Context. Meaning, he says, you're right. Uven ein lo doesn't always mean the son to the exclusion of daughter, and doesn't always mean progeny to the exclusion of non-progeny. It's on context. He says, how do you know? So he goes like this. How do you know that by Yerusha, it definitely means male child and not female child? Because it said so. Thank you. That was not hard. Thank you, Rami. Sometimes you can't overthink things. Because it said so. Right? It's explicit. If there is no son, it goes to the daughter. It's clear. Ben ein lo means son, male. Nitzma'atu. But in the context of Yibum, the only thing that's excluded are progeny who don't count halachically as your progeny, like children that you have from a shifcha, from a maidservant. right? But anyone who counts as your progeny counts. Why? And he said, what's the contextual cue that teaches that in this context it is all children? What's the key? How does it know? Right? How does the Torah know? Does it just make it up? What's his answer? Is it really just a pun on ayin alav? No, he says it's more than that. It's context. What's the context? What does Yibum say? What's the purpose of Yibum? If he has no children, then his brother needs to do Yibum to accomplish what goal?
Protecting his legacy.
Yeah, but how does the Torah describe that? What does lo yimacheh shemo b'Yisrael mean? Is their name will not be erased, blotted out. So the Refresh makes a very simple argument. By Yerusha, we know that Ben means son because it's contrasted with daughter. But the context in Yibum tells you that all we need is a child that will make it that it's not the case that his name is blotted out. So he says it's very simple. The standard of your name is not blotted out is a lower standard than Yerusha. Meaning, any child, grandchild, son, daughter, makes it that you are not completely forgotten. By Yibum, the standard is who exists that will ensure that your name is not blotted out if you don't perform Yibum. And the answer to that question is son, daughter, grandson, granddaughter, any descendant is enough to fill uven ein lo if your standard is lo yimacheh shemo b'Yisrael, that the person is not forgotten. But when the standard is ben versus bat, obviously, it's son versus daughter. And therefore, reverse says, yes, it's the same words. But what you learn is the following. Yerusha, the unique Yerusha really requires son. By Yibum, you don't really need son. What do you need? Lack of memory being erased. In that context, daughters and sons and grandchildren are equal. In the context of Yerusha, they are not. So now, based on how Rav Hirsch deals with the drashot, what would you guess? Is Yerusha of daughters equivalent to Yerusha of sons or not? No, right? Rav Hirsch tells you very explicitly, right? So what you learn from the parsha of Yerusha is that when it comes to Yerusha, male children are unique. Daughters count as sons for the purpose of Yibum because they accomplished lo yimacheh shemo b'Yisrael, that his name is not wiped out. And therefore, if there is a daughter, you don't do Yibum. That's only enough now if you want to fill out what a person doesn't spell out. That's enough to tell you that since daughters, the existence of daughters is enough to make it that sons are not, that the father's memory is not erased, that's enough to tell you that daughters are enough to negate the possibility of Yibum, and logically enough to tell you that what? Daughters are on the list of heirs. The list of heirs is enough to tell you that they're related enough that they inherit, but it's not enough to tell you that they inherit in the way that sons do. Right? That's Rav Hirsch's analysis. Let's look at the Torah Tamima. The Torah Tamima says as follows: L'cha'orat tzarich iyun. We must investigate. It's not only in the case of Yerusha that Ben is understood to mean literally male children and not children, broadly speaking. Right? By the way, this should be obvious, but if it wasn't obvious, then we should spell it out. Why is it that the word Ben has that ambiguity? Thank you. Right? It's because the default in Hebrew is male, right? Because we have gendered words and nouns and pronouns. Therefore, Ben, in its limited context, means son. right? But banim can also mean children because the standard is, right, the default is male-gendered words. That's why there's always this ambiguity. So, Torah Shmima says, we know that sometimes Chazal are very nitpicky, and they say ben means male children, such as Bnei Yisrael v'lo benot Yisrael, Bnei Aaron v'lo benot Aharon, V'chein mefurish b'nazir daf yud ben, Areini nazir k'shei libein, the older bat, nazir. If someone says, I'm only a nazir if I have a ben, we assume he means male child and not female. V'chein matinu v'shuvat harash klal pehei, de'ein abonu b'chal banim, mishum t'chliv b'alma v'yulad banim v'banot. And the Rosh said that in general, when it comes to children, we assume that ben means son and not child, because since the Torah often talks about banim uvanot, that means that the Torah is fully aware of how to say sons and daughters. Therefore, the default is that banim literally means sons and not children. Ve'ein lo mara pi hadrasha uve'ein lo ayin alav im gen gam habanot bechlal. So now he says, but what is the one case in which the Torah, as understood by Chazal, seems to say that ben, by default, doesn't mean son but means child? Yibum. Because by Yibum, we say uve'ein lo means child, not son. So he says, doesn't that contradict the notion that ben usually means the gendered version of that word, i.e. son? So what's his answer? Ze'eno. What's his answer? Answer one is, that's the point of the drasha of ayin alav. Right? Meaning, Rav Hur said, ayin alav is not the real drasha. The real drasha is, lo yimachesh shemo b'Yisrael. Right? Torah Shmima says, no, ayin alav is the drasha that tells you to be expansive. Which is, look carefully. Don't just look at the superficial, which is, does he have male children? Really look into whether he has any type of ben, which is ben, bat, ben abat, bada ben, bada, etc. Child, son, daughter, grandchild, grandson, granddaughter, grandson from the son, granddaughter from the son, grandson from the daughter, granddaughter from the daughter, right, etc. But then he says, okay, that's not enough. So what is it? So at first he says it's from ayin alav, but then his conclusion is, no, it's ayin alav coupled with the contextual clue that Rav Hur cared about, which was lo yimachesh shemo b'Yisrael. Right? Yeslomer the shani yachal the ikar kavanot inyan yibum u'shlo yimachesh shemo b'Yisrael to move a parsha im kein mechevan she'ez lo bat gam gen ein shemo nimche. Okay, so based on everything we've just seen in the last half hour, right, the simplest read of all the sugyot and the psukim, etc., is that if there is a unique Yerusha to sons, to children, it is limited to male children, to sons. What we mean in English by sons, right? The gendered version of that. Yes? Okay. And if that was all it was, I would say that is the end of the sugya. But it is not always that clear. Okay? There are other places where it sounds this way, but what I want to do is read a few Gemaras carefully and see what implications we get. Okay? So let's start with the Gemara on Kuf Yud Aleph. Kuf Yud. Kuf Yud Amud Aleph. That's what I meant to say. Right? So the two dots at the end of the page in Kuf Yud Amud Aleph says, Habanim et Ha'al. Sons inherit from their father, fathers inherit from the son. Minolan.
Where are we going?
Bottom of Kuf, what? Kuf Yud Amud Aleph.
No, it's Minolan.
Minolan, yeah.
Where do we know?
Where do we know what? That sons inherit first. So the Gemara gives a very easy answer. This is not a secret. What is the answer? Dichtiv ish ki amut v'gomer uven en lo taima de'en lo ben. The only reason you go to those secondary heirs is because there is no son. Ham yesh lo ben kodem. But if there is a son, he always goes first. So at that stage in the Gemara again, which would you guess? Are sons unique? Yeah, 100%. Amar le Rav Papa le Abaye, but Rav Papa says to Abaye, Ema, why don't you read the pasuk as follows? Ika ben lirosh. I'm going to read it as lirosh, meaning it's lirosh, but meaning that's because the taf and shin are interchangeable, right, between Hebrew and Aramaic. So if you didn't know what the word meant, it's what it means. It's what yoresh means in Hebrew, right? So Ika ben lirosh ben Ika lirosh ben. That if there's a son, the son inherits. Ika bat lirosh bat. If there's a daughter, she should inherit. Ika ben uvat lo hayri lirosh lo hayri lirosh. But if there's a son and a daughter, then nobody inherits. Okay, pause at that Havamina. What is the Gemara suggesting? What is the logic behind that very, very bizarre Havamina? What is the Gemara saying?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
You read this Gemara, right? I just told you to read Gemaras, right? There are sources after that, but I told you Gemaras first. I'll read that line again. The Gemara says, how do you know that means son, daughter, father? Maybe it means Ika ben lirot ben. Ika bat lirot bat. Maybe it goes like this. If there's a boy, the son inherits. If there's a daughter, the daughter inherits. And if there's a son and the daughter, nobody inherits.
So what? Like once it's birth?
Now, obviously, what's the Gemara's immediate question? Yes, obviously. But before we get to the answer, come on, Yaakov, be a good Chavetz Chaim boy. We have it. Yes, the answer is the next line is obvious, right? But Havamina, what is a Havamina? What is the Gemara's? What is the conceptual underpinning of this very bizarre possibility?
Oh, well, I mean, don't know where the line would go.
Because
they both have a good plan, but for some reason, both a son and a daughter can't vote.
So why wouldn't the Havamina be split? Right? The obvious question is why? How could you even say the Havamina?
Because in the Havamina, they both have equal plans, but only the other one's not shared.
Right, exactly. It sounds like in the Havamina that sons and daughters at a certain level have, equal potential, but only if they are the exclusive heir. Now, if you'd ask me, why would you have a Havamina that you only inherit if you are the exclusive heir? How would that even make any sense?
Well, I mean, the reason why this could present this.
Well, conceptually, why in God's name would you say that?
Because we're going by you believe that the son that is not working through Yerusha yet, it's working through the
Right. I would have said exactly what Yaakov said. Is that if you say that sons aren't really Yorshim, they are Memale Makom Aviv, right? They fill the father's place. You could have at least had a Havamina for a second to say that you can only fill somebody's place if you're the only one, right? Meaning, if someone has one and only child, we all know this, right? Like only children, like the way their parents treat them is different than parents who have multiple children, right? Because all their hopes are pinned on that kid, right? It's a bigger letdown if their son is not, or daughter, or whatever, is not the way they planned. But when you have multiple kids, I assume most parents who have multiple kids don't even have even your only child, the chances are going to be exactly like you is next to nothing. But when you have multiple children, the chances that all your children are going to be exactly like you is vanishingly small. So you don't count on that, right? So I would have said that that's a Havamina. But if that's the case, you come up with a very fascinating possibility, which is that the Gemara might have thought, are sons and daughters equal in that respect?
Yeah.
Yes, except that sons come first. Meaning, sons come first, but when a daughter inherits, she inherits in the way that a son does. Right? That's at least one potential read of this Gemara. Right? Which is, sons come first, but if there is a daughter, the daughter inherits in the way that a son does.
And then there's an exclusionary daughter.
Meaning, if there's only a daughter, so then she is like a son. yes, you have to pick who comes first. The son comes first. But maybe when there is no son and there's only a daughter, the daughter inherits. Now, obviously, the Gemara rejects the whole Havamina, and the question is, how much does it reject? But obviously, this Havamina had to go in the garbage because ve'ela man, right? Yerosh, because then who should inherit? Meaning, that's not a possibility, right? That's crazy talk, right? You can't say that if there is a son and a daughter, then nobody inherits. I mean, that's just weird. Atu bar kasha demata leirish, right? I mean, what's the alternative? A stranger? Right? The guy has multiple children, so you just give up and say, oh, I'm sorry, you have multiple children, so your legacy is now dispersed, so forget it. Your kids get nothing, and we will now give it to the first person who walks into your house. We will give him deed on your house, right? No, that's not, right? That's crazy. That can't be the case. And therefore, the Gemara rejects this entire analysis. So the Gemara says, you're right. I never meant that. This is what I meant. Ika ben uvat Lo hayrira kulei, lo hayrira kulei, ela ki adade lirtu. I might have a havamina that when you have a son and a daughter, they inherit equally. Oh, okay. Now explain that havamina. The first havamina was ridiculous, but now the Gemara says, okay, that's obviously not the case. You don't need exclusive inheritance rights. That's a bit too lumdish for anybody. Because the practical implications of that very lumdish possibility are insane, right? And therefore you reject radical lumdish in favor of common sense. Okay, fine. But why would you say conceptually that you might think that a son and a daughter inherit equally? What is the logic there?
Okay, the idea being that, the way that the Gemara is that the way the philosophy is phrased is only a exclusive
Meaning the Torah tells you not the case, but if it weren't for the pasuk sounding that it's exclusive, you might have thought that children are children, and therefore sons and daughters split equally. I mean, that's a pretty clear statement. The Gemara had at least a half amina, right? Entertain a half amina in the Torah that children should be equal, sons or daughters. And that's exactly what the pasuk is coming to reject. But how much is it rejecting it? What are the two possibilities? Once the Gemara rejects it, what are the possibilities? Either it's rejecting, right? Meaning what? Either it's saying, look, daughters are not like sons, or it's saying daughters are like sons, but only if there are no sons. Meaning, clearly, sons and daughters don't inherit together, but there's two reasons that could be true. One is what? It's an order of precedence. Sons come before daughters, or it's the issue of qualitative distinction. That sons are mamale makom aviv, and daughters are not, and that's why sons come first. Right? So which is it rejecting? The Gemara Havamina that sons and daughters should be equal. But when it rejected, is it simply saying that sons and daughters conceptually are equal? Does sons come first? Or is it telling you no, sons come first because they do what daughters can't? So Amar le Abaye challenges this read that this was even a Havamina. The Etrich Kralash Minan Heichad Litle Elachad Bra. Do you need a pasuk to tell me that if there's only one son that he gets everything? Right? Maybe it's coming to tell you Debat Nami Bat Yerusha, that daughters also inherit. So the Gemara says, yes, that is the pasuk. That's not the first pasuk, it's the second one. So Rav, meaning in Bamidbar Lamed Vav. So Rav Acha Bar Yaakov Ramehacha. Lama Yigora Shem Avinu Midoch Mishpachto Ki Ein Loven. Benot Lavchad said, why should our name be lost from his family because our father has no son, implying Time Badain Loven, which implies that if he doesn't have a son, Hayesh Loven Ben Kodem, which means that even they understood that sons go first. So the Gemara says, no, that's not a proof. Why not? That's not a proof that daughters don't inherit with sons. Why? Because maybe the Benot Tzlaf were articulating the law pre-Matan Torah. And that's why they were asking the question. But once the Torah introduced that daughters inherit, what might you think? That the Chiddush of the Torah was exactly this point, that what? That daughters are like sons. Maybe that was the mistaken assumption of the Benot Tzlaf, but nitna Torah v'nitchadsha halacha. So Ella michvarta kiddushanin meikara. Therefore, the Gemara says you're right. Once you start going down this, right, we could have all types of defenses. It must be that at the end of the day, how do we know that sons inherit before daughters exclusively? Uven lo. That is the proper way of reading uven lo is, as we said originally, that sons inherit before daughters exclusively. Right? Now, by the end of this Gemara, you could in theory read it both ways, right? Meaning either sons are unique, daughters are not, or that sons and daughters are unique, but sons still get precedence. But, you could read it both ways. Which do you think is a stronger read of the Gemara? Right, again, it's clear that by the end, if they're sons, daughters don't inherit at all. But is that because sons and daughters are equivalent, but sons still get precedence, or because sons and daughters are fundamentally different? So Rami thinks the former is more likely. Okay, I tend to think the latter. I don't know. Right, and at this stage in the Gemara, my tendency is to think that we've basically exhausted the Havaminas that daughters are unique, but I understand both of them are left open, right? Meaning we know that sons come first exclusively, but it's not clear whether that's simply an order of precedence or because sons are unique and daughters are not. But you're right. At this stage of the Gemara, it's still pretty open, right? We know that that the halachic conclusion of the Gemara is that sons inherit exclusively when there are sons and daughters don't, but again, it's not clear if that's merely precedence, meaning that sons come first, or telling you that sons are more your children than daughters in some way, right? And so until now, you're right, it's ambiguous. I still might think that it favors the pshat that sons are more fundamentally heirs, but it could go either way. But what about the next line? The next line, Ravina's line, I don't think is ambiguous, as ambiguous. Ravina Amar Mehacha, what's Ravina's proof? Hakarov Elav. The pasuk by Yerusha says that who inherits? He who is related to you, who's close to you. Hakarov Karov Kodem. The closer the relative, the earlier it comes. Umay Kurva de Ben Mibat. How do you know that sons are more related to you than daughters? Sheben kam tachar aviv liya'ada ulistei achuza. Because sons fill their father's place for yi'ud and for stei achuza. So what does that line sound like? Right? As ambiguous as the concluding lines after Abaye are, what does Ravina's argument sound like? That was radical. What?
He said that because sons prevent evil.
He didn't say evil yet.
What?
He said son Yi'ud. Right? No. He says, no, I have a substantive reason why sons go first. Okay. Not the Zera Katuv, and that is because sons can do what daughters can't. They are closer to their father than their daughters because they can take the father's place for Yi'ud, for marrying Brian for Steachuza, right, which we'll get to in a little bit. Well, no. At this stage of the Gemara, at this stage, in this Havamina, what would you think? Is Ravina making an argument that sons are merely come before their fathers, or the fact that sons come before daughters is evidence of a fundamental distinction in the way parents relate to sons and parents relate to daughters for these purposes? What would you say at this stage in the Gemara? What?
Yes.
What do you mean? He says he's karov kodem. He says the rule is karov kodem. The closer the relative, the earlier they come. And sons are more karov to their fathers than daughters are because they take the father's place for Yud and Seachuzah.
Right, yeah. I mean, I agree that those reasons suggest that.
No, I don't want the reason. Ravina, I'm asking you, what does Ravina sound like? The fact that Ravina invokes those to prove that sons are karov kodem, what does Ravina seem to believe? Yeah, right. I mean, if you ask me, I would say at least Ravina seems to believe that the reason that sons come first is not simply because it's a Gzera Katuv, but rather sons are fundamentally more capable of taking the place of their fathers.
Yeah.
Why? I didn't say the next line. That's the Gemara's response. I said line by line here. Yud is obviously Yud is not a good proof. That's the Gemara's next point. The Gemara was also aware that women can't marry women. Okay, the Gemara wasn't that progressive. Okay, right? The Gemara was aware of the next line. Okay, yes, the Gemara knew that. It's not there yet, right? At this stage, imagine what Ravina sounds like. Right, Ravina is saying the reason sons come first is not just Gzera Katuv, but because they are closer relatives, as evidenced by Yud and Seachuzah. So that sounds like Ravina is saying, no, it's not just that sons come first. Sons come first because they're inherently, conceptually, more linked to their father. Right? I don't remember if I actually gave you all on the story sheet, but because there's so much Gemara here, there is a Havamina at some point in Gemara that sons inherit their fathers, but daughters will become first, inheriting their mothers. But that's actually a Havamina in the Gemara, which is a fascinating, fascinating possibility, but we reject it, but it's fascinating.
Earlier when you said that there were two different things that it could mean by they lived together, and one of them was that not maternal brothers because
Right, the way it says in the Torah is Miuchadim min Achala, the way Meshech Chochmah says it is because they don't live in the same place. Right, they're not Yatzah physically.
If you're able to inherit from your mother, then
yeah, that's part of the problem. Yeah.
Okay. So,
yes, and we have it right. But at this stage in the Gemara, at least the Havamina of Ravina sounds like sons are inherently more related than daughters, meaning their Yerusha is more primary, not just in order, but in nature. It's more just more fundamental. They're more linked to their parents. Now, Ezra and Rami are both geniuses, and they knew the Gemara's next line, which is, really, you're proving from marrying a woman that sons are more primary than daughters? You've got to be kidding me. The reason that your daughter cannot perform Yud is because she can't marry the maidservant, because she's a woman. This is not because she's more your child or less your child. It has to do with the marriage, right? It's not about the relationship between the parent and child. It's between the relationship between the potential spouse here, right? And he says, really? Ya'adah? Bat lav bat ya'adahi. The reason that the daughter doesn't perform Yud is not because she's not as related. It's because she can't marry a woman. That's it. So the Gemara says, okay, but what about Stei Achuzah? Right? Isn't that a decent proof? Stei Achuzah nami me'ai pircha gufa hu dikakaima leiletana klum yeshibum ela b'makom she'ein ben. She said there's a problem by Stei Achuzah. And what is the problem of Stei Achuzah?
That a daughter who purchases it will not be able to.
Yes, but
What is a woman not able to purchase property?
no. So this is what we'll see. We haven't looked at the Gemara yet, but what we'll see, and I'm not going to bias you yet to the Gemara, but the Gemara's point is Stei Achuzah is not a primary law either. it's true. Again, I'm being ambiguous here because you haven't read, I assume none of you got to the Gemara in Erechim yet. No, so I'm not going to bias you because exactly what the Gemara means is important here, right? But the Gemara says it's whatever is true by Se'achuzah is itself not a primary law, it's a derivative law from Yibum, right? And therefore, you can't prove anything directly from Se'achuzah. Okay, I'm being ambiguous, forgive me. So, so therefore, he says, we have to reject this whole line of analysis, go back to Uven and Lo, meaning literally son before daughter, which means that Ravina had a Hava Amina, which is that what? The reason sons come first is because they're more closely related, and not just like Zera Katuv Uven and Lo. The maskana is that line of analysis that proves that sons are more closely related falls apart. So again, that leaves you with an ambiguity. I think it's almost definite that Ravina's Hava Amina, attempted line of argumentation, were that sons become before daughters on fundamental grounds, that the Yerusha of sons is unique in the way the Yerusha of daughters is not, but whether that's maintained Lamaskana, right, is less clear. Alternatively, the following drasha, and you shall give the Yerusha to your sons and not daughters, so the Gemara says, really? You think that every time we talked about Nachala, it means sons? And that's the given? Which again seems to be more fundamental than just precedent. What about what about in the bracha in the second parak of Shema that you shall be blessed, you and your children, where we would hope that means progeny? The Gemara says, is that hachanami v'nechem lo b'nei v'techem? Is that sons and not daughters? The Gemara says, no, bracha shayni. When it comes to a bracha, clearly blessings applies to all your children. But when it comes to inheritance, it applies to sons uniquely. Now, what does that mean? Again, it's a little bit unclear. Does that mean because when it comes to Yerusha, sons are unique? Or because when it comes to Yerusha, it's obvious that sons are first? I would say that on balance, my guess is that the maskana leans slightly in the direction that sons are unique. But the truth is that the strong lines of argumentation that very clearly say that sons are unique and not just first are consistently rejected in favor of the Gzera Katuv Ben Lo. And therefore, the maskana, it's hard to prove one way or the other from the Gemara. Right? Clearly, certain Havaminas were very clear in one direction or the other. Right? Meaning, we had Havaminas that pushed very strongly in the direction that sons are fundamentally more related than daughters, but we also had Havaminas that pushed strongly in the direction that they're not, such as the Havamina that sons and daughters should, right, both inherit exclusively, and if there's a son and a daughter, neither inherit, right? Which is weird as the Havamina was. For at least a minute, the Gemara clearly entertained the possibility that sons and daughters have unique ability to fill their father's shoes, right? But the maskana, it's not 100% clear whether, right? Again, we had Havaminas that push in both directions. But the maskana, when it's rejected, it's not clear whether it's choosing a side or leaving you with ambiguity. Okay, what we'll see tomorrow then is that on Kuf Tet and Yerushalmi, and what we're going to see is several other statements of Chazal where this ambiguity is not as ambiguous, right? I thought I'd do this sheet in 2 days, but it might actually be that this sheet will take us 3 days. I don't know. But we'll see. Again, I want to do this very carefully, because once we do this sheet, I want to then move to, like I said, my logic is this. First, I want to figure out whether the Yerusha of daughters, when it does happen, is unique. The next thing I want to do is, okay, when there are sons, it's clear that limaskana, do daughters inherit? No. But in practice, do most from people come up with some way of making sure that their daughters get something in inheritance? Yes. So then we have to deal with two things. One is that a good thing, or is this giving into external value systems? right? And if we assume that no, it's not a bad thing, the question is, how do we do it? That I'm not, definitely the last question, I don't care for you to like do it on. I'm going to survey it for you. Right? I want to get you through what I see as the main conceptual and philosophical questions, right? Which is Yerusha of daughters like that of sons when it does happen? Is the choice of the Torah to not let daughters inherit fundamentally a statement that they should inherit, or merely precedent, maybe based on, the agricultural land-based society when they were in, right? But not a fundamental opposition to daughters inheriting in principle, and therefore coming up with mechanisms that make it as if daughters inherit is not anathema to our sensibilities, right? I want to get you that far. Then obviously, just to sort of fill out the picture, we'll do a survey of all the mechanisms we use so that daughters can inherit, but I would not like to take more than one day on that, because that I don't care everything's inside as much. I just want you to understand the mechanisms that are in place. I want to get you to understanding why those mechanisms are in place first, okay? But like I said, I'm doing this slowly because I don't want to rush it. I want to make sure you understand. Tefillah, let's say at 12 o'clock.